job is to disturb you. Somebody died here once. It's haunted. I always start my tours with that joke. Breaks the ice. And let's face it, most ghost stories, most ghost tours, that's all you really get. We will give you window dressing. You'll be told who died. You'll be told who killed them. You'll be told how horrible it was. But most ghost stories are shallow, because they're not real. I don't say they're not true. Big difference. To be true, all you need is for two people to agree that something happened. There you go, you can call that true. But for something to be real, it's got to be here. Watching, listening, and crucially, able to reach out and have an effect. That's what makes things real. The ability to have an effect. And that's why this one's different. It's a story that would change the world again and again. It's a story that would inspire some of the greatest fictional horror that there's ever been. And it is the story of a monster. But it begins on a happy note. So that's something. And for that, we're going to go over to where that bloke was standing. Ooh, a tree. What's that? Oh, of course, this fell down. Yeah, that's nice. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England did the very first useful thing in her long life. She died. Even better, she died with no heir to her throne. And so James VI, the King of Scots, became James I, the King of England. The United Kingdom was born. Our king moved to London to steal as much as he could before they changed their mind. But they didn't change their mind. They liked him. He was a good king. And he liked them. Because being the King of England was a lot more fun than being the King of Scots. And the distinction is important. The King of England, the King of Scots, not the King of Scotland. There was no King of Scotland, not since John Balliol. Because when we replaced John Balliol with Robert the Bruce was excommunicated. He had very slightly kind of stabbed somebody to death in a church under a banner of truce. Now, to be the King of Scotland, you needed the Pope's blessing. And the Pope said, no. He stabbed a guy to death in a church. We said, slightly, yeah. And the Pope said, get out. We were not allowed to crown him the King of Scotland, so we crowned him the King of Scots. And the difference is the Declaration of Arbroath, a written constitution, a document that states that the King of Scots took their crown not by right, not because of who they were, not because of land they owned, and certainly not because God chose them, but because we chose them. The community of the realm grant the crown, and we grant it on condition that the monarch defends our liberty, and if they do not, we take our crown back. Rule by consent, the beginning of democracy. But the King of England, according to their traditions, divinely appointed. God's right hand on earth. And by this point, they had their own church to back it up. And that was going to be a real headache for us. The Church of England is a simple reformed version of the Roman Catholic Church. The king or queen replaced the pope at the head of the organisation. But the organisation is the same. It's a hierarchy. You get people, and in charge of the people you put priests, and in charge of the priests you put bishops, and in charge of the bishops, the head of church. And in England, the head of church was the same as the head of state, both tied together. But most of us in Scotland were Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians reject hierarchies. God is in charge, and under God, a king, a beggar, a bishop We're all the same thing. There's no hierarchy. There are no bishops. That's why the cathedral isn't really a cathedral. I guess it wasn't that long a story after all. Huh. Church and state, completely separate. These two ways of running a country are completely incompatible. But James really liked the idea that God put him in charge of everything. And so he asked all the people of Scotland to convert our church to be like the Church of England and to give up the decoration of Arbroath. No, we said. Bugger off, silly king. He was a silly king, but he couldn't force us and he knew it. He had to drop it. Unfortunately, he had a son. Charles I was an idiot. He commanded us to convert. And in this little churchyard, famous all over the world for a dog, we replied with the National Covenant, a document that stated, "Dear King, in all matters of the kingdom of earth, we will bow to you, but in matters of faith, we only bow to God, and you are not God." We suggested that if he truly wanted to govern Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales as one union, then he would require, and I quote, "a democratically representative government of and for the people, a separation of church and state, and the freedom of religious practice for every citizen of the union." And if that sounds kind of familiar, that's because the Americans lifted it, word for word, as the preamble to their constitution. They called it democracy, and that's cool. We called it the Covenant, and that's cooler. Charles called it treason. He ordered a bloody suppression of the Covenant, of the Covenanters. He ordered that people should ride up and down the country, challenging you to prove your faith. And if you failed the trial, you could be killed on the spot. The Covenanters were no meek lambs. They fought back and they began to win. Eventually, a Covenanter army invaded the north of England, and the king begged the English Parliament for money and troops to fight us, and that started the English Civil War. And the English Civil War erupted into the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and began centuries of sectarian fire and bloodshed throughout Great Britain and Ireland that never ended, still fighting it today. Cost Charles his throne, and it cost him his head. It brought Cromwell, his Commonwealth, and then Charles II. And in 100 years of sectarian fire and bloodshed, civil war and murder, one man earned himself the nickname Bloody. And that was George Mckenzie, the Lord Advocate of Scotland, head judge, the king's right-hand man, who sentenced men, women and children as young as 9 to be tortured to death for the crime of having a different religion to their king. And that's reason enough to call a man bloody, but that's not where he got his nickname. In 1679, 2,000 Covenanters formed an army and marched on Stirling. They were going to seize an armoury there to better prepare themselves for future endeavours and engagements. Mckenzie and the king's troops were sent out to engage them. Mckenzie's orders were clear, and they survive in writing. He was to draw up his battle array, wave the white flag of parley, and if the Covenanters would discuss terms, the king's terms were, if they laid down their weapons and dispersed and returned to their homes, they would be given fair treatment, full quarter, full pardon. Mckenzie got confused. He drew up his forces in battle array. He waved the white flag of parley, and when the Covenanters' leaders stepped out to discuss terms, he sounded a charge. He committed a massacre, but he was the government and he won, so we call it a battle. And at the Battle of Bothwell Brig, 600 Covenanters died in the initial charge. The remaining 1,400 odd men were surrounded, completely outnumbered and outgunned now. Mackenzie drew up his forces around them and offered the king's terms. Drop your weapons and agree to disperse, you'll be given fair treatment, full quarter, full pardon. And the fools believed him. And they dropped their weapons, and he immediately broke the terms. 1,400 men were roundly beaten, their shoes removed, chained together in pairs, and they were marched barefoot at gunpoint 30 miles from Stirling to Edinburgh with no food, no shelter and no treatment for injury. After 3 nights' march, when they reached Edinburgh, 16 of them were publicly tortured to death without trial, and those 16 were the lucky ones, because the remaining prisoners, 1,184 by now, were dragged through the streets of Edinburgh, hauled through the gates of Greyfrairs Kirkyard and dragged all the way across this little graveyard, famous all over the world for a dog. And on the other side of this iron gate, George McKinney desecrated the sanctity of Greyfriars by turning this into a concentration camp. The Covenanters were stripped completely naked and forced to lie face down in the mud from July through to December. Snipers were placed along the walls of the Covenanters' prison. Anybody who moved without permission was to be shot where they lay. If they spoke without permission, they were to be dragged out, lined up against the wall, and then shot. The wall bears musket holes from the time. As these Covenanters had rebelled against civil authority, McKinney said they had forfeited their civil rights, and he was not obliged to feed them. The only food they got was that smuggled in by sympathetic supporters or forced in by the Anglican Bishop of Edinburgh. He kept records. He provided enough bread to keep a third of their number alive. Over 6 months, 238 prisoners are recorded as starving to death. 262 recorded as dying of malnutrition, exposure, injury or complication of injury sustained in the battle or the march. 300 are understood to have escaped or to have been ransomed, and 126 are recorded as being shot. But after 6 months and after 600 deaths, there were 250 men left, and Scotland's conscience had begun to creak. Charles II commanded the survivors of the Covenanters' prison be deported to Barbados to live out their lives as slaves, and he left McKinney in charge. 3 ships carried the survivors of the Covenanters' prison to the middle of the North Sea. Off the coast of Orkney, the crew chained the prison cabin shut, set the ships on fire, and rowed away in the lifeboats. By the time he died peacefully in his sleep in 1691, George McKinney, humanitarian, had sent somewhere between 10 and 30,000 human beings to their death. As the Lord Advocate of Scotland, the Articles of Union state he is to be buried in Westminster Cathedral, but Westminster wouldn't touch him, so they buried him over there. An acorn-topped and domed mausoleum, the tallest tomb in the graveyard, the largest tomb in the graveyard, 40 feet away from where he committed this act. And from the second that they put him in the soil, the haunting began. Keeney's funeral was a lavish affair, but as soon as his family had departed, 3 young boys from Heriots, Hogwarts, ran over to the tomb. One of them shouted through the door, "Unsneck the lock, draw back the bar. Bloody McKinney, come out if you dare." And according to his 2 compatriots, something appeared to seize him by the throat, and he was throttled unconscious. So they dared their friends to do it the next day. And a group of 5 young boys ran up to the tomb and repeated the phrase, and one of them was throttled unconscious. It attacked children, only boys, and only when they taunted it. So maybe they had it coming. But because it only happened to young boys, many people will tell you that this was a practical joke. But this happened consistently for 100 years. And then it just stopped. The boys continued to gather, continued to taunt, stopped being throttled. But the day after the last attack at that tomb, something new apparently appeared in Edinburgh. On a side street of the Royal Mile, down from where we started, it's called Nidri Street. Today it's a pub, wonderful pub, it's called the Banshee Labyrinth. But back then, it's where George McKinney's house stood. And in one room of what had been his house, people began to be throttled by a ghost that was nicknamed the Watcher. For 100 years, the Watcher remained active there. But the legends tell us it moved gradually south through the structure, gradually down into the cellars beneath, and then it vanished into the vaults of the underground city. But the underground city was all sealed off, all documentary evidence suppressed in 1900. The trail went cold. But when the South Bridge vaults were uncovered in 1980, as soon as people began to explore them, they began to be throttled by a ghost that was nicknamed Mr. Boots, because it stomped around before it throttled. But in 1998, that tomb was desecrated. Mr. Boots went quiet. This place became active. These gates used to be open to the public. There are notable people buried in here. We've got James Hutton, the father of geology. Joseph Black, the father of thermodynamics. Mary Erskine founded many important schools and charitable organisations and hospitals. We've got, well, Name's just dropped out of my head. James Burnett, the guy who came up with the theory of evolution and natural selection 100 years before Darwin's birth. These people used to get visitors, but their visitors began to be bitten, burned, scratched, slashed, bashed, bruised, and throttled unconscious. Church of Scotland do not believe in ghosts. Their teachings are that when you die, you go instantly to heaven or hell. There's nothing else in between. So they sent in their senior exorcist to put an end to this nonsense. The minister attempted an exorcism, but suffered several violent fits and attacks during his attempt. His colleagues dragged him out, saying that they believed his life to be in danger. They were right, and they were too late. He died from the injuries and exertions of the attempt shortly thereafter. The gates stayed locked, and now we're the only people that go in. So before we go in, a couple of things. First up, 9 out of 10 times, nothing happens. 9 out of 10 times, if something does happen, it's not a big thing. It's subtle. People hear things, people see things, electronics malfunction, you get anomalies in photographs. Nothing to worry about. About once a week, twice a week in a good week, we get minor injuries. People being bitten, burned, scratched, slashed, bashed and bruised. Sounds dramatic, it's not. There's no pain. There's never any pain. Most people don't even notice it's happened until later. They go home, they're getting ready for bed, and they go, holy crap, I'm covered in scars. Basically, if you get anything, what you will get is a cold spot. A cold spot is not a gust of wind. It's not, I'm attending an outdoor event in Scotland in December. It is a sudden, violent change in the air temperature. It hurts. If you are thinking, am I in a cold spot? You're not in a cold spot. If you get a sudden, violent, painful drop in temperature, it feels like falling under ice, all you need to know is that a cold spot is exactly what it sounds like. It's that spot. It's highly localized. It doesn't move. You can. Big step, you'll be fine. Stand still, you're going to get injured. Run away, you're going to get stuck because I'm locking us in. The graveyard's open to the public. This is not, and I don't want anybody joining us unexpectedly. So I am going to lock us in. What's that? That's okay. I thought it was something more dangerous. I'm going to lock us in. If anything happens to me, I am faking it, and I give you my permission to nominate one member of the group to kick me. Not the face, not the crotch. Anywhere else is fair game. If you do not get a response, smallest, roundest, brass key. Get out. Last, once a month, we will get somebody throttled unconscious. That's not an exact figure, that's just how it works out roughly. It hurts. There's no warning, there's no protection, there is nothing I can do to stop it if it starts. If this thing attacks properly, it will attack one. Grab them by the throat, seals off the airway, they don't make a sound. Drags them to the ground, and every time this has happened so far, they have been unconscious before they have hit the ground. Typically, they remain unconscious for about 5 minutes. If it happens, I will drag you out and call an ambulance. Don't worry if anyone's an American, they're free. Typically, you wake up with a headache, an elevated blood pressure, and quite often have quite horrible nightmares, but we've never had any really serious long-lasting effects after that. But for the purposes of my own protection, I do not, I will not, I cannot guarantee your safety from the second we cross the threshold. If you trip over something that I should have pointed out and I did not, I am legally responsible for your safety, and our public liability insurance covers us. If something invisible decapitates you, I am not. If you have any health concerns, if you have any heart conditions, if any of you have high blood pressure, low blood pressure, dislocation syndrome, epilepsy, may be pregnant or have diarrhea, or there is any reason at all why you should not be violently assaulted by a ghost, I am not a doctor. Don't ask me for advice. You join us at your own risk, of your own volition, and if something happens, I will be the first one running. And give this to whoever's at the front, just so you get some light with you. It's quite an obvious there's quite an obvious path. Just walk straight to the end of that path and I'll be right with you as soon as I've locked the gates behind us. Thank you. Attacks have occurred all over the Covenanters prison. They've happened at the gate, they've happened at the back wall, and they have happened everywhere in between. But statistically, this is where they have happened most often. We're not sure why. This grave bears no connection to George McKinney or to the Covenanters. None of these tombs stood at the time this was a prison. This was just an opening area surrounded by the wall running along the back. So fish in a barrel for the snipers. All of these tombs have been built since. They have no connection to the Covenanters that we are aware of, no connection to McKinney. The family tomb that this belongs to, they were fairly politically quiet. Thomas, I believe Gifford was the surname. Most important job he ever had in life was as an assistant to the Lord Leon of Arms. That's the guy who gives people the heraldic crests and tartans. It's a politically neutral position. Thomas seems to have been a nice guy. We don't think it's Thomas. We think this tomb has just been built somewhere important, but we're not sure why. What we do know is 3 out of every 5 things that happens in here happens around this tomb, and 99% of throttlings happen around this tomb, so this is where we're going. There is a step. It's not a big step, but it exists. So it goes kind of up, flat, down. Take your time. There's an iron bar sticking out the door frame about 3 inches at my shoulder height, so mind your heads, shoulders, knees and toes. Knees and toes. I will be standing in the door, facing you inwards, otherwise my voice just melts out the front. You can stand pretty much wherever else you like, just give me some spitting distance. In we go. Give your eyes a little bit of time to acclimatise to this, because I'm going to do that storytelling thing where I turn the torch upwards, and as soon as I do, my shadow is going to loom up behind me. Ooh. I move it around, your shadows will loom up behind you. And this shadow moves constantly. You can all clearly see that's the gate, but I see movement out the corner of my eye. I might do this. Relax, nothing happens up there, it happens over here. I'm kidding, of course. It happens at the back. I'm kidding, of course. It happens to you. 1998. Pitch black. Thunder and lightning. A dark and stormy night. Howling wind and pouring rain. A typical July summer evening in Edinburgh. And a homeless man was wandering the streets looking for shelter. You and me would not go into a haunted graveyard on a dark, stormy night, but we have homes. I'm guessing. The homeless man did not, and on a night like that, you get a roof, you get walls, you get shelter. It's not completely insane. And in 1998, there were 14 tombs in this graveyard that he could have sheltered in that had never been haunted. He walked up to the haunted one. Now, McKinney's tomb has got a big sturdy roof, solid walls, and uniquely, it's got an accessible downstairs burial chamber. As far as shelter goes, it is the loveliest tomb in the graveyard, but it's haunted. There hadn't been a violent attack since 1791, that everybody knew that was the one and only haunted tomb in the whole graveyard, and this nutter decided to focus on the positives. So, he shoulder barged his way through the door of the tomb, held together with a little padlock, stepped inside and went down into the burial chamber. In the burial chamber, he found 4 mysterious wooden boxes, 6 feet long with people's names on them. And you're thinking, that's not mysterious, that's coffins. But he just couldn't figure it out. He thought wooden boxes underground could be treasure, and he just had to know. So he pried loose a slab of stone flooring, hauled it up on his shoulder, and started to hammer it down in one of the coffins to find out if there was treasure. He broke the coffin lid open and found human remains. And this surprised him. He staggered back and stood exactly where he just pulled a big chunk of the floor out. So he fell through the hole he'd made, the floor caved in around him, he plummeted down and knocked himself out. He regained consciousness under the tomb, somewhere dark, wet, kind of crunchy. Whenever the plague broke out, we had a lot of dead bodies, and we didn't have time to give them all individual burials. So quite often, we would crack open an old tomb, cram it full of plague victims, then cover it up, say a quick prayer, and don't tell anyone. Plague victims lower house prices. Under Mckennie's tomb, there was an older crypt belonging to a family called the Forests, and the British Army tell us that there were somewhere between 100 and 320 bodies interred therein. These things were 300 years old, but the tomb had been completely sealed. The top layer were dust, but deeper down there were discernible, recognisable chunks of putrefied human remains. And the homeless guy had brought the weather with him and made it all wet. So he lit his lighter and immediately wished he hadn't, because now he could see dead bodies. He gasped in horror and immediately wished he hadn't, because now he could taste them. He started to gag and then vomit, bleed, scream and run in one truly unimaginable movement. Clawing his way out the dead bodies, he hauled himself up to the burial chamber and vomited all over that. Staggered up to the main chamber and vomited all over that. Threw himself out into the dark, stormy night, gasping for clean air, howling obscenities and vomiting uncontrollably. Just as security guard Graham walked past. 62-year-old Graham had a plastic torch and a 14-week-old Alsatian puppy. As he patrolled the haunted graveyard on a dark, stormy night, he walked past the haunted tomb, where thunder clapped, lightning flashed, the door of the tomb burst open, and out came a humanoid covered in rotting flesh, vomiting and swearing. So Graham figured that obviously the dead were rising. He shouted, "Zombie!" through his torch and ran. The puppy ran the other way, and the homeless man was hit in the face with the torch. So he chased the man that had thrown a torch at him. And for the next 10 minutes, Graham was pursued through the streets of Edinburgh by what he genuinely believed to be a zombie, until his frantic cries drew the attention of the police, who wrestled them both to the ground, and it all got sorted out. I remember this. It was in the newspapers the next morning. I remember reading it and thinking, that's fantastic. But it was just the beginning. The next day, a Texan gentleman had come to Edinburgh to visit the grave of James Hutton, a few headstones up. As he passed this tomb, he said there was a gust of stale air, and when he looked in, he said there was a figure standing right at the back in long robes with a hand outstretched. It seemed to move. That was the last thing he remembered. He was found here, unconscious. Paramedics were called, they put him in a trolley and took him out of the graveyard, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, he sat bolt upright and started to scream, and the paramedics report says his throat was then compressed as though he were being throttled by an invisible hand, and he went straight back out. Another throttling happened the next week, and the next week, and the next week, and so the council locked the gates. The Church of Scotland sent in their exorcist. The exorcism failed, and the gates stayed locked. At this point, stories were beginning to spread around Edinburgh. My boss, local historian, said, "It's the Mackenzie Poltergeist, isn't it?" And the council said, "We have no idea what you're talking about." And my boss said, "Let me guess, people are being throttled unconscious." And the council said, "We have no idea what you're talking about." My boss said, "Let me in, I want to document it." The council said, "No, nobody's going into the Covenanters prison, it's closed indefinitely." My boss said, "I will sign a disclaimer, let me in." The council said, "No." Boss said, "I'll get a team of volunteers, we want to study this." The council said, "No." My boss said, "I'll charge people money and give you some of the money." And the council said, "Yes, that will work." The City of the Dead Tours were born. Documenting it when it attacks people. And for that, we need people for it to attack. Thank you all for coming along this evening. We've been documenting this for over 20 years now, and in that time we've had a lot of theories. We've had a lot of experts, both scientific and paranormal, coming in here trying to figure it out. The best scientific theories I can tell you about have all been disproven. The initial one was pheromones. Some of you will already be thinking, oh no, it's okay, this has been completely discredited. But the theory was that human beings excrete chemicals that communicate emotion. In this case, fear. I become frightened. I release these chemicals that tell you, subconsciously, there's a reason to be frightened. So you become frightened and you release these fear chemicals, and in a small confined stone space, if we're all releasing these pheromones, we overdose and have a group hallucination. Brilliant theory. Unfortunately, we've never ever had a group effect. This thing only ever attacks one, and more importantly, despite what the aftershave companies claim, pheromones have never been found in human beings and they have no effect upon us. Better scientific theory: unstable electromagnetic charge in the atmosphere, caused, they believed, by Edinburgh University's Artificial Intelligence Unit that used to be right behind us, but wasn't 330 years ago when this started and isn't there now. Plus, you can detect unstable electromagnetism. We've never found anything here. Best scientific theory: the American Navy came here, not the whole Navy, but a group of them came here, and they thought that what we were describing sounded like an attack of low-frequency sound vibration. Low-frequency sound can make you see things, hear things, fall over, void your bowels. It can even generate burns. It's brilliant. So they came in here, they spent 6 months trying to detect any low-frequency sound, and they found out, unfortunately, the stone of this tomb and the stone of this graveyard dissipates low-frequency sound. It's impossible to sustain it in here. So the scientific theories so far haven't had anything much interesting to say. Spiritualists all tend to say the same thing. They say, it's George Mackenzie. It's got to be George. It's haunted his locations. It's tied to his tomb. It's nasty like he was. And it haunts because there is justice that he does not rest. But reality is rarely just. George Mackenzie might be the headline grabber in that tomb, but he's not the only one. There is George, there's his wife, there's his daughter, and there's his son, George Jr., 12 years old when he died. This thing used to attack children, only boys, and only when they taunted it. It's childish, it's boyish. We call it a poltergeist. Poltergeists are easy. Poltergeist lasts 2.5 months to 5.5 years at a real push. They can last longer, but it's very rare they do. But most importantly, poltergeists are attached to a particular person. We call them the focus. Scientific theory, it's them. They are generating the activity. The ghost theory is the poltergeist is a being that attaches to them and feeds off their emotions. Either way, they are haunted. If they go, it goes with them. So I think George Mackenzie's son, George McKinney's son, George Jr., could have had a poltergeist attached to him when he died. And I think the little boy came back, poltergeist still attached. Poltergeists are most common around disturbed adolescents. This little boy's dad sent tens of thousands of people to a needless and violent death. He's the perfect candidate. And in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, I think the wee boy has come back with the poltergeist attached. And when other little boys made fun of him, he lost his temper, and that triggered the poltergeist to make them stop. Then it moved after 100 years, ran back to the family home, where if people didn't leave him alone, he lost his temper, that triggered the poltergeist. It moved down into the cellars beneath, maybe somebody played as a child, until eventually, in the underground city, he was left alone. When the vaults were disturbed, the little boy was disturbed, and that triggered the poltergeist. And in 1998, when that tomb was disturbed, I think he felt it, came running back, and just when he thought he was going to be left alone in here, people dressed like me started turning up, with large groups of people talking about his dad and the things that that man did in his life. And if we say the wrong thing, if we outstay our welcome, or if I upset that little boy, that triggers the poltergeist, and the poltergeist makes me stop. That's just my theory. Now, we are ran in association with Edinburgh City Council. They make all the rules. They've got one rule that they insist on more than any other, and it's the worst rule they've got. It is a strict and utterly non-negotiable time limit. I'm not permitted to keep you standing inside of the tomb for longer than exactly 6 minutes. No good reason, they just decided, so I forget to check the time. I talk till I'm done, or until somebody's been throttled. I'm running out of things to say, so if anybody was on the ground, that would be... It doesn't always happen. I know some people find that disappointing, but whenever it does happen, whoever it happens to gets dragged out, usually bleeding, usually pretty upset. I wish every single one of you had been violently physically assaulted this evening. If you would have preferred that, visit Glasgow. Just this way. What we are going to do is we're going to step out of the Covenanters prison over to Mackenzie's crypt. It's a shame, thank you, not to give that a wee look just before we finish up. We'll do a very brief epilogue, and then perhaps spirits of a different nature can knock us unconscious.